England, today, one of the four nations of the United Kingdom, has long stood at the heart of the British Isles. It is the largest by land and population, and for centuries it has been the most powerful and influential of its neighbors. Yet the story of England is not one of dominance alone. From its earliest days, this land absorbed the peoples and cultures who arrived on its shores: prehistoric settlers, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans, each leaving an indelible mark. Out of conquest, migration, and transformation emerged a distinct language, culture, and identity that would shape not only the destiny of the British Isles, but also much of the modern world. The history of England is therefore a tale of resilience, adaptation, and enduring influence. Prehistoric and ancient Britain. Long before written records, human footsteps marked the land that would become England. Over 8 millennia ago, rising seas turned this region into an island, fostering a uniquely independent way of life for its inhabitants. By around 4000 BC, Neolithic farming communities thrived. They cleared forests with stone axes and raised crops and livestock, yet still hunted wild game in ancient woodlands. These early Britons left behind enduring mysteries in stone, great megalithic monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, testaments to their ingenuity. Stonehenge, begun over 5,000 years ago, was built and modified in stages with colossal stones, some hauled nearly 400 kilometers from Wales, erected in precise circles. To this day, nobody knows for certain whether it was a temple for Celtic Druids or a giant astronomical calendar, but its construction over millennia attests to a sophisticated culture. The isolation of Britain after the seas rose meant these prehistoric people developed largely undisturbed by outside invaders, forging their own path on the misty Isle. By the Bronze and Iron Ages, Celtic tribes had spread across ancient England. These Britons farmed the land and crafted tools and jewelry of bronze and iron while living in tribal kingdoms. They built hill forts atop ridges as both community centers and refuges in war, hinting that conflicts over territory were growing. Still, life for centuries followed a steady rhythm of farming and trade. Britain's very separation from the continent was a double-edged sword. It sheltered the Celts from constant warfare seen elsewhere, yet it also left them little prepared for the ambitious empire that eventually cast its gaze across the Channel. Roman conquest and rule. In 55 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar made a daring landing in Britain, probing this mysterious land beyond the known world. Though Caesar's expeditions defeated some Celtic warriors, they were brief incursions, and he soon withdrew, content with token tribute. It was not until AD 43, under Emperor Claudius, that Rome mounted a full-scale invasion with 4 legions, over 20,000 soldiers, and auxiliary troops to subdue the Britons. Fierce resistance flared, most famously the revolt of Queen Boudica of the Iceni in AD 60, who led her chariots in a fiery uprising that burned Roman towns including Londinium. But ultimately, the disciplined Roman war machine crushed all opposition. Britain became the province of Britannia, and Roman rule would endure for nearly 4 centuries. Under Rome's Pax Romana, Britain witnessed its first taste of a globalized civilization. The Romans brought gifts of civilization. They paved long, straight roads from coast to coast, some of which still form the backbone of modern British highways. They built prosperous towns, complete with forums, amphitheaters, baths, and temples to Roman gods. To guard the northern frontier, Emperor Hadrian in AD 122 ordered a monumental wall to be built across the width of the island. This Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 miles from coast to coast, stood as a barrier against the wild Pictish tribes of Caledonia, Scotland. Remnants of this stone fortification still wind across lonely hills, reminding us of Rome's imprint on Britain. Later, the Romans even pushed further and built the Antonine Wall in Scotland, though it was held only briefly. For generations, Britannia flourished as a far-flung but vital part of the Roman Empire. Over time, many Britons adopted the Latin language and Roman customs, and cities like Camulodunum, Colchester, and Eboracum, York, grew under Roman governance. However, by the early 5th century, the empire was ailing. Distant power struggles and relentless barbarian attacks on Rome forced the legions to retreat from Britain. In AD 410, the last Roman troops departed, leaving behind towns, roads, and a people suddenly cut adrift. The Romano-British inhabitants, who had lived in relative peace under Roman law, now faced a power vacuum. As the Eagle standards vanished south across the sea, Britain stood on its own, free from foreign rule, yet exposed to new waves of invaders poised beyond the shores. Anglo-Saxon and Viking Era. In the wake of Rome's exit, the Britons hoped to reclaim their land and live in peace. But their independence was short-lived. Soon after 410 AD, Germanic warriors from across the North Sea, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began landing on England's eastern shores. According to legend, local Briton leaders at first invited some of these warriors as mercenaries to help fend off raiding Picts from the north. The invitation backfired terribly. The Anglo-Saxons came not just as hired swords, but with their families intent on settling. They found a fertile land ripe for the taking and a people weakened by recent turmoil. Bit by bit, these pagan Germanic tribes conquered the fractured Brittonic kingdoms. The native Celtic Britons were pushed to the western and northern fringes, into the wilds of Wales, Cornwall, and the Highlands of Scotland, becoming strangers in their own homeland as a New England was born. By the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons had established numerous small kingdoms, known later as the Heptarchy. Among them, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex emerged as the strongest realms, vying for supremacy. The Anglo-Saxons brought with them their Old English tongue, from which modern English would eventually evolve. They worshipped their own gods until Christianity arrived on the island's shores once more. In 597 AD, a Roman missionary, Augustine, converted the King of Kent, sparking a rapid Christianization. By the 8th century, churches and monasteries had spread across England. This new faith united the Anglo-Saxons culturally and intellectually, even as their kings still warred for power. Then from the north came yet another ferocious threat, the Vikings. Starting at the end of the 8th century, seafaring Norsemen from Scandinavia began conducting lightning raids on England's coasts and rivers. The first notorious strike fell in 793 AD on the island monastery of Lindisfarne, where Vikings slaughtered monks and looted treasures, sending shockwaves through Christendom. These invaders, known to the English as Danes or Norsemen, were relentless. After 865 AD, Viking armies arrived, not just to plunder, but to conquer and settle. They seized control of large swathes of the east and north of England, an area that became known as the Danelaw, toppling Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. By the 800s and 70s, only the Kingdom of Wessex in the south, led by King Alfred the Great, still held out against the onslaught. Alfred of Wessex proved to be a heroic figure in this dark time. In 878, after a surprise Danish invasion, Alfred was driven into the marshes of Somerset, seemingly defeated. But from the marshy refuge, he rallied his people. In a daring counterattack, Alfred won a decisive victory against the Viking king Guthrum, and the invaders were pushed back. Through savvy diplomacy, Alfred drew up a truce dividing England, allowing the Norse settlers to remain in the north and east, while Wessex and its dependent territories held the south and west. Alfred and his successors, his son Edward and grandson Athelstan, not only defended against the Vikings, but went on the offensive. By 927, King Athelstan had united the various lands into a single kingdom of England, becoming the first king over all the English. Yet the Viking menace was not over. Fresh waves of Norse invasion in the early 11th century once again engulfed England. A weak Anglo-Saxon king, Ethelred the Unready, failed to stem the assaults. For a time, a Danish king, Knut the Great, even ruled England from 1016 to 1035. The Anglo-Saxon line was restored under Edward the Confessor, but by 1066, when Edward died childless, England was vulnerable and ripe for the taking once more. 3 rivals vied for the throne, and the stage was set for a conflict that would forever change English history. Norman Conquest and Norman Rule. The year 1066 arrived, and with it, a storm from across the Channel. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that the English throne had been promised to him. But the Anglo-Saxon crown was taken by the powerful English Earl Harold Godwinson. As if fate were testing Harold, that autumn he faced 2 invasions simultaneously. First, a Viking army led by Norway's King Harald Hardrada landed in the north. Harold rushed his forces and, in a fierce battle at Stamford Bridge, defeated the Norse, ending the Viking Age threat once and for all. Yet even as Harold celebrated in the north, word came that William of Normandy had crossed the Channel with a formidable force. Exhausted but determined, Harold force-marched his army south to meet this new invader. On October 14, 1066, the 2 armies clashed at the Battle of Hastings in Sussex. The fight raged all day, Norman knights charging uphill against a shield wall of axe-wielding Anglo-Saxon housecarls. As evening neared, legend says King Harold was killed by an arrow through the eye, and his line fell. The Anglo-Saxon army, leaderless and weary, broke. William had won a crushing victory. On Christmas Day, 1066, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, ushering in a new era of Norman rule. Norman rule utterly transformed England. William confiscated the lands of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and granted them to his Norman barons, uprooting the old social order. To cement control, the Normans built scores of mighty castles across the realm, towering stone fortresses like Warwick Castle and Windsor Castle that still stand today. These castles, often built atop strategic hills or river crossings, served as bases for Norman power and a stark reminder to the populace of who was in charge. The Normans also imposed their own language, Norman French, which in time would blend with Old English to create Middle English and brought continental feudal customs. King William, ever meticulous, also commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, an extraordinary kingdom-wide survey of lands, people, and resources. This record, listing everything from the number of pigsties in a village to the acres of farmland, was intended to assess taxes and feudal dues. The Domesday Book remains a priceless historical document, providing a detailed snapshot of 11th century England. Despite the iron grip of Norman rule, challenges arose. After William's death, his successors faced unrest and rival claims. A great crisis known as the Anarchy from 1135 to 1154 erupted when King Henry I's only son perished and a dispute over succession led to civil war. Local lords built adulterine castles and warred on each other while royal authority waned. The turmoil ended only when Henry II, Henry I's grandson from the French Plantagenet line, secured the throne in 1154. With Henry II's accession, The Norman dynasty gave way to the Plantagenet dynasty, and England's Middle Ages entered a new chapter. Yet the Norman legacy lived on, in stone keeps and cathedrals, in a nobility of mixed French-English blood, and in a kingdom now firmly oriented toward the affairs of Europe, no longer an island apart. The Plantagenet era and medieval conflicts. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, he founded the Plantagenet line, also called the Angevins. Energetic and astute, Henry II controlled not only England, but vast territories in France, inherited through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine and his own ancestral lands. In effect, the Plantagenet kings ruled an Angevin empire spanning from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Henry strengthened royal justice and administration, but his reign was marred by clashes with the Church, famously his quarrel with Archbishop Thomas Becket, who was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. The Plantagenet era would span over 3 centuries, and it would see England rise to glory and reel into chaos by turns. One early milestone came under King John, Henry's son. John's heavy taxes and military failures, including the loss of Normandy to the French, infuriated his barons. In 1215, they rebelled and forced John to sign the Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Liberties. This document, extracted at Runnymede Meadow, was essentially a peace treaty, but it established a fundamental principle. The king himself was not above the law. Magna Carta required the monarch to respect feudal customs and the rights of nobles, towns, and the church, and it laid the groundwork for the formation of a parliament to consent on taxes. Though medieval kings would often ignore or reinterpret it, Magna Carta became a cornerstone of English liberty and governance in the centuries to come. The 13th and 14th centuries saw England drawn into epic contests abroad and turmoil at home. English kings, as feudal lords of lands in France, long claimed the French crown itself. In 1337, under King Edward III, England began the 100 Years' War against France. For over a century, intermittent wars raged across French soil. England won stunning victories at Crécy 1346 and Agincourt 1415, thanks to tactics and the deadly English longbow. At one point under Henry V, it seemed England might indeed conquer France. But fortunes shifted. By 1453, the French finally expelled the English from all their continental possessions, except Calais. The protracted war drained England's treasury and decimated its nobility. At home, the common people suffered heavy taxation and waves of plague. The Black Death struck in 1348. Social tensions exploded in events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of peasants marched on London, furious about oppressive taxes and serfdom, even storming the Tower of London. Although the revolt was quelled, it shook the establishment and marked the beginning of the end for serfdom in England. By the mid-15th century, England spiraled into internal war, a dynastic conflict later called the Wars of the Roses. Rival branches of the royal family, the House of York, symbolized by a white rose, and the House of Lancaster, red rose, contested the throne, each claiming descent from the sons of Edward III. Fighting raged on and off for 3 decades. Kings were dethroned and restored. Henry VI, a Lancastrian king, was deposed by Yorkist Edward IV, then briefly reinstated, only to die in the Tower. Noble families were wiped out in battle or by execution, and the stability of the kingdom was shattered. Finally, in 1485, the feud culminated at the Battle of Bosworth Field. There, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a tenuous claim, defeated the last Yorkist king, Richard III. Richard III fell on the field, and with him, the Plantagenet dynasty perished. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, becoming the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. He cemented his victory by marrying Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose and White Rose and symbolically ending the War of Roses. Under the Tudors, England would know greater stability and embark on an age of bold transformation. The Tudor dynasty and the English Reformation. Henry VII's shrewd reign from 1485 to 1509 restored peace and fiscal order to a realm exhausted by civil war. But it was his son, Henry VIII, who truly etched the Tudor name into history. King Henry VIII from 1509 to 1547 is often remembered for his larger-than-life persona and his 6 wives, a famously turbulent marital record. Yet the consequences of Henry's matrimonial adventures went far beyond palace gossip. They triggered a religious revolution. Desperate for a male heir, Henry VIII sought to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, when she did not bear a surviving son. The Pope's refusal to annul the marriage provoked an extraordinary reaction. In 1534, Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. Thus, England's Protestant Reformation began not from the grassroots faith of its people, but from the top-down will of a king, rooted in his personal dynastic anxieties. The Church of England was born essentially Catholicism, without the Pope, at first, and Henry dissolved England's monasteries, seizing their wealth for the crown. For his people, this was a time of upheaval. Sacred relics were cast down, Latin Mass replaced by English prayers, and those who resisted met grim fates on the scaffold. Still, Henry's audacious move freed England from papal authority and transformed its spiritual landscape forever. Despite marrying 6 times, Henry VIII left only one sickly son, Edward VI, and 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. His son, Edward VI, ruled briefly as a child king and pushed further Protestant reforms, but died at 15. The crown then passed to Henry's elder daughter, Mary I, in 1553. A devout Catholic, Queen Mary zealously tried to reverse the Reformation. She restored Catholic bishops and practices and took a hard-line stance against Protestants. Her persecution of hundreds of Protestants, burning dissenters as heretics, earned her the grim nickname Bloody Mary. Mary's harsh reign and her unpopular marriage to Spain's King Philip II made her feared and disliked. After 5 tumultuous years, she died childless, and the throne went to her half-sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I reigned from 1558 to 1603, would become one of England's greatest monarchs. She re-established the Protestant Church of England, yet sought a middle way that might quiet religious turmoil, enforcing outward conformity, but often pragmatically tolerating private belief. Elizabeth was a charismatic, brilliant ruler, fondly called Gloriana by her subjects. Under the Elizabethan era, England flourished in a true golden age. The Queen's astute leadership and famed virgin status, she never married, declaring herself married to England, gave the kingdom stability. Commerce and industry grew. English ships ranged farther across the seas. Sir Francis Drake, one of Elizabeth's sea dogs, circumnavigated the globe from 1577 to 1580 and returned with holds full of Spanish treasure and exotic spices. At home, culture flowered splendidly. William Shakespeare and his contemporaries penned masterpieces of drama and poetry that remain jewels of world literature. England's growing confidence inevitably led to clashes with its Catholic rival, Spain. In 1588, when Elizabeth rejected a marriage alliance and supported Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, King Philip II of Spain launched a colossal armada to invade England. The Spanish Armada was reputedly the mightiest fleet ever seen, until the smaller, nimbler English ships, aided by favorable winds, harried it up the channel. In a decisive battle, the English Navy used fire ships and daring tactics to scatter the Spanish formation. A great storm did the rest, wrecking many Spanish galleons on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a triumph that electrified England. It marked the rise of England as a major naval power and dealt a blow to Spain's supremacy. However, the costly wars strained the treasury, and by the end of her reign, Elizabeth faced economic difficulties and some discontent. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, the Tudor line ended with her. She left no heir. Yet the legacy of the Tudors was profound. They had transformed England into a unified, sovereign nation with a distinct national church and a burgeoning sense of its own destiny. The crown passed to Elizabeth's cousin, James Stuart, King of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Thus began the Stuart dynasty, one that would soon collide with Parliament and plunge the kingdom into civil war. But it was the Tudor foundation, a strong centralized monarchy, and a bold Protestant national identity that set the stage for England's coming rise and its future conflicts. The Stuart era and Civil War. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, he inherited the English throne amid great expectations. Yet James, raised in Scotland, struggled to understand the unique English balance of power between king and parliament. He espoused the divine right of kings, believing monarchs were appointed by God and answerable only to him. Parliament, however, had grown accustomed to having a say, especially in taxes and laws, and England's political culture valued the rule of law established since Magna Carta. Tensions simmered. James I managed to avoid open conflict, but his son Charles I, who succeeded in 1625, was even more obstinate. Charles I's autocratic tendencies, levying taxes without Parliament's consent, and his attempt to enforce religious conformity alienated many. In 1629, feeling rebuffed, Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled alone for 11 years, a period called the Personal Rule. But financial strains and rebellion in Scotland forced him to recall Parliament in 1640. This Parliament, led by fiery critics of the king, demanded reforms. Charles's attempt to arrest his leading opponents in the House of Commons proved the final straw. In 1642, civil war erupted between king and Parliament. The English Civil War split the nation. On one side stood the Royalists, aristocrats and Anglicans who backed the king. On the other, the parliamentarians, including many Puritans and merchants who championed Parliament's rights. At first, the king's seasoned nobles and cavalry scored successes. But the parliamentarians found an indomitable leader in Oliver Cromwell, a devout Puritan gentleman with a genius for war. He forged the new model army, a disciplined, ideologically driven force. In battles like Marston Moor 1644 and Naseby 1645, Cromwell's army crushed the king's forces. Charles I was captured, and in a move that stunned Europe, Parliament put the king on trial for treason. In 1649, Charles I was executed, his dignified demeanor on the scaffold unable to save him from the axe. For the first time in its history, England had killed its king and abolished the monarchy, declaring itself a commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the dominant figure of the new English Commonwealth, which also encompassed Scotland and Ireland by force of arms. Though initially a Republican Commonwealth, by 1653, Cromwell grew disillusioned with fractious politicians and forcibly dissolved Parliament. He assumed direct power as Lord Protector, essentially ruling as a military dictator. During his rule from 1653 to 1658, England was a republic in name, but Cromwell's will was law. The Puritans imposed a strict moral code, theaters were shuttered, Christmas festivities banned, while Cromwell waged brutal campaigns to subdue Ireland and Scotland. After Cromwell's death, his son proved a feeble successor and resigned. Yearning for stability, the nation invited Charles II, son of the executed king, to return from exile in 1660. The restoration of the monarchy brought back gaiety and a sense of normalcy. King Charles II, with his lively court, even reopened the theaters that the Puritans had closed. Yet the Stuart saga had another act. Charles II's reign from 1660 to 1685 was mostly peaceful, but his brother James II, who succeeded in 1685, reopened old wounds. James II was openly Catholic in a now staunchly Protestant nation, and he again asserted royal prerogatives and favored fellow Catholics in high offices. Fearful of a return to tyranny or a Catholic dynasty, a group of English nobles reached out in 1688 to James's son-in-law, William of Orange, a Protestant Dutch prince married to James's daughter Mary. In what became known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, William landed in England with a small force. But there was no pitched battle. James II found himself deserted by his army and fled to exile. William and Mary were offered the throne by Parliament, but under strict conditions. In 1689, they accepted the English Bill of Rights, a landmark law that reaffirmed Parliament's rights and limited the monarch's powers. The Bill of Rights enshrined principles like regular parliaments, free elections, and no taxation or royal laws without parliamentary consent. It also barred Catholics from the throne, reflecting the nation's resolve on that matter. The Glorious Revolution thus firmly established England as a constitutional monarchy, where kings would reign, but Parliament would truly rule. Never again would an English monarch govern without regard to Parliament or the law. As philosopher John Locke wrote approvingly, the people had the right to depose a king who broke the social contract. The Stuart dynasty continued through Mary's sister Anne, but real power had shifted. England, soon to be part of Great Britain, now looked ahead to an era of commercial and imperial expansion, powered by Parliament and the rule of law, with the excesses of absolute monarchy left in the past. Georgian Era and the Industrial Revolution. In 1714, the crown passed to the German-born George I, first of Britain's Hanoverian kings, after Queen Anne, the last Stuart, died without an heir. Under the Hanoverians, George I, George II, and George III, the 18th century saw Britain's government evolve into the system recognizable today. Power shifted further from monarch to ministers. Sir Robert Walpole, often called the first Prime Minister, led the country's affairs under George I and George II, heralding a tradition of cabinet government. Meanwhile, England was rapidly advancing in trade, science, and industry. This era gave birth to the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain and would profoundly change the world. Key inventions mechanized production. In the late 1700s, ingenious devices like the spinning jenny for textiles and James Watt's improved steam engine turned Britain into the workshop of the world. What once took dozens of spinners or weavers working by hand could be done faster and cheaper by machine. By the early 19th century, coal-powered steam engines drove factory looms and propelled the first locomotives and steamboats. Billowing smokestacks became a common sight over burgeoning industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham. The new factories produced unmatched volumes of cotton cloth, iron goods, and other manufactures, fueling Britain's wealth. An intricate network of canals and later railways crisscrossed the land, moving raw materials and finished goods with unprecedented speed. The social impact was immense. People flooded from rural villages to grimy urban centers in search of work, and a new industrial working class was born. While industry boomed, Britain's ambitions abroad also grew. Victory over France in the 7 Years' War in 1763 left Britain dominant in Canada and India, expanding a colonial empire. However, Britain's empire building hit a shocking setback with the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1783. 13 North American colonies, outraged by taxation without representation, rebelled. Despite Britain's military might, the Americans, with French assistance, won their independence. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 was a humbling blow. Yet under leaders like Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, Britain rebounded, turning its focus to Asia and other parts of the globe. By the late 18th century, Captain James Cook charted the Pacific, claiming Australia and New Zealand for the crown. British merchants and soldiers entrenched their hold in India, while explorers and traders reached deep into Africa. The final challenge of the Georgian age came from revolutionary and Napoleonic France. In the 1790s, Britain found itself in a titanic struggle against Napoleon Bonaparte, who sought to dominate Europe. Napoleon massed forces along the Channel, threatening to invade. But the Royal Navy, led by admirals like Horatio Nelson, kept command of the seas. Nelson's decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 shattered the French fleet. On land, Britain subsidized continental allies and dispatched troops to fight Napoleon's forces in Spain. The showdown came in 1815 at Waterloo in present-day Belgium, where Wellington, with Prussian help, finally defeated Napoleon once and for all. The Napoleonic Wars confirmed Britain's status as the preeminent global power. As one French general grudgingly noted, Britain's weather and Britain's navy foiled Napoleon's dreams of conquest. With the French threat removed, Britain would enjoy a century of relative peace in Europe, a time in which its empire and industry would reach dazzling heights. Victorian zenith of the British Empire. By the 19th century, Britain stood unchallenged as the world's superpower. The period from 1815 to 1914 was an era of Pax Britannica, an unprecedented century of general great power peace over which Britain, with its mighty navy, acted as an informal global policeman. At home, Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 and reigned for an astounding 64 years. Under her steady hand, Britain's empire swelled to become the largest in history, and the nation experienced an explosion of innovation, prosperity, and confidence, often dubbed the Victorian Age. Industrially, Britain was the workshop of the world. Coal and steam powered an enormous manufacturing economy. Technological and scientific achievements abounded. Michael Faraday's discoveries in electricity, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859, and engineering marvels like Isambard Kingdom Brunel's bridges and railways. Culturally, too, Britain led the way with great novelists Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, poets Tennyson and Browning, and a flourishing of the arts and architecture. London became the heart of global finance, and the British pound was the currency of international trade. The British Empire reached its apex in Victoria's time. Through trade, colonization, and sometimes war, Britain extended its dominion across 1/4 of the globe. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand developed as self-governing colonies of British settlers. In Asia, India, the jewel in the crown, was ruled by the British Raj after 1858, providing tea, cotton, spices, and soldiers for the empire. Large swaths of Africa came under British control, from Egypt to South Africa, especially after the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. By the 1880s and 1890s, British maps were colored imperial red on every continent. It was boasted that the sun never sets on the British Empire, as daylight always shone on at least one territory under the Union Jack. Britain's dominance was not uncontested. Rival powers, particularly a newly unified Germany, began seeking their place in the sun. By the turn of the 20th century, Germany's Kaiser was building a navy to challenge Britain's, and Europe had divided into hostile alliances. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and her grandson, King George V, would soon face the greatest test in British history. On the eve of World War I, Britain still possessed the world's mightiest navy and an empire spanning the globe. However, it was also stretched thin and facing industrial competition from Germany and the United States. The Edwardian summer of the early 1900s, a time of elegant society and optimism, would be cut short by the thunderclap of global war in 1914, a war that would strain Britain's power and society to its core. World War I, 1914 to 1918. The First World War shattered the complacency of the Victorian Edwardian age. In June 1914, a gunshot in Sarajevo, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, triggered a diplomatic crisis that rapidly spiraled into a cataclysmic war. Britain entered World War I in August 1914 after German armies violated neutral Belgium on their march toward France. On one side were the Allied powers, Britain, France, Russia, and later others including Italy and the United States. And on the other, the Central Powers led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. British leaders and citizens initially expected a short, decisive conflict. Instead, the war became a prolonged nightmare of trench warfare, industrialized slaughter, and unimaginable scale. For Britain, World War I was a struggle for survival and a test of national will. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, fought heroically in 1914, but by 1915 the war had bogged down into stalemate on the Western Front in France and Flanders. Trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, and waves of British soldiers went over the top into machine gun fire for mere yards of mud. New weapons, poison gas, tanks, heavy artillery inflicted terrible carnage. The Somme offensive of 1916 typified the war's horror. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, on July 1, 1916, British forces suffered 57,000 casualties, including about 19,240 killed, the deadliest day in British military history. Whole villages worth of men who had volunteered together in PALS battalions were mowed down in minutes. Over the course of the war, Britain mobilized nearly 9 million soldiers. About 750,000 British troops were killed, and countless more were wounded, a sacrifice that touched almost every community and family. An entire generation of young men was decimated, and the collective trauma ran deep. The war raged not only in France. In the North Sea, the Royal Navy fought Germany's High Seas Fleet at the Battle of Jutland, 1916. Though indecisive tactically, Jutland ensured the German fleet never again seriously threatened British control of sea lanes. Meanwhile, British forces battled the Ottomans in the Middle East and Germans in Africa. On the home front, industry was geared for total war. women stepped into factories to replace the men gone to fight, proving their capability and bolstering calls for women's suffrage. After years of deadlock, 1917 brought upheavals. Russia fell into revolution and exited the war, but the United States entered on the Allied side, sending fresh troops and supplies. By 1918, the tide had turned. British forces, alongside their allies, broke through on the Western Front, using new combined arms tactics and tanks. In November 1918, exhausted and outnumbered, Germany agreed to an armistice. The victors rejoiced, church bells rang, and crowds cheered, but it was a bitter victory. Britain emerged on the winning side and its unbeaten reputation intact, yet at a staggering cost. The economy was drained, the national debt enormous, and the social fabric strained by grief and hardship. The high hopes of pre-1914 were buried in Flanders fields. As one British leader noted, the war to end all wars had left a land fit for heroes promised to the returning soldiers, but reality fell short. The 1920s saw unemployment and labor unrest as Britain struggled to rebuild. Nonetheless, some positive changes arose. In 1918, women over 30 were granted the right to vote, extended to all adults by 1928, recognizing women's vital wartime contributions. The war also spurred advances in medicine, technology, and a sense of a more modern, egalitarian society. Britain had endured the Great War, but the experience left an indelible mark on its psyche and a fervent desire to avoid another such catastrophe. World War II, 1939 to 1945. Tragically, the resolve to avoid war was tested barely 2 decades later. In the 1930s, a new threat emerged: Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, rearming and aggressively expanding in Europe. The specter of the previous war's slaughter haunted Britain's leaders, who at first tried appeasement, allowing Hitler to annex territory in hopes of satisfying his ambitions. But when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France concluded that aggression could not go unchecked and declared war. World War II had begun. The early years of World War II brought Britain to the brink of disaster. In spring 1940, Hitler's armies overran Western Europe with shocking speed. France fell in June 1940, leaving Britain suddenly isolated, the lone holdout against Nazi domination in Europe. New Prime Minister Winston Churchill rallied the British people with defiant oratory. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Throughout mid-1940, in the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force heroically fended off the German Luftwaffe's attempts to gain air superiority for an invasion. Night after night during the Blitz, German bombers rained destruction on London and other cities, killing tens of thousands of civilians, but never breaking British morale. In those dark times, ordinary Britons endured rationing, blackouts, and danger with stiff resolve, a period remembered for its Blitz spirit of unity. By late 1941, the war widened. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union and Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the USSR and the United States into the conflict on Britain's side. Still, 1942 was filled with peril. In North Africa, British forces initially suffered stinging defeats to German General Rommel's Afrika Korps before turning the tables at El Alamein. In the Atlantic, German U-boats preyed on vital shipping convoys, threatening to starve Britain of food and supplies. Worse yet, early 1942 saw a string of Allied setbacks in the Far East. Japan seized Britain's colonial strongholds of Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, shattering the myth of European invincibility in Asia. The British Empire, at its greatest extent just a generation earlier, was now under siege on multiple fronts. But as in the First World War, Britain and its allies slowly turned the tide. By 1943, the Red Army's resistance in the East and Anglo-American victories in North Africa and Italy began to squeeze the Axis powers. British industry, coordinated by Minister Ernest Bevin, reached peak production of aircraft and ships, aided significantly by American Lend-Lease aid. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, British Commonwealth and American forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, storming the beaches of Normandy to begin the liberation of Western Europe. Churchill, standing amid the ruins of London, could finally see the end in sight. In May 1945, after fierce fighting into the heart of Germany, Hitler was defeated and Europe was free from Nazi tyranny. Jubilant crowds celebrated victory in Europe, though the war against Japan continued until August 1945, when atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's surrender. Britain emerged in 1945 on the winning side, one of the big three victors, but at an enormous price. World War II had truly been, in Churchill's words, the worst ordeal in our long history. Over 60,000 British civilians were killed by bombing, and around 383,000 British soldiers, sailors, and airmen lost their lives in the struggle. Much of London and major cities lay in ruins from the Blitz. The economy was bankrupt. Britain had amassed huge debts to finance the war effort, relying on aid and loans from the U.S. to stay afloat. Rationing of food and fuel continued even after the war. Yet the war had also brought out Britain's fortitude and ingenuity, from the codebreakers of Bletchley Park cracking the Enigma code, to the Dunkirk spirit of civilian boats rescuing the Army, to scientists like Alan Turing and Frank Whittle, inventor of the jet engine, pushing the boundaries of technology. The British people entered the post-war world exhausted, but determined to rebuild their beloved land. Post-war decline and legacy. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain faced a new reality. The country was victorious but drained, financially crippled, its cities scarred by bombing, and its global dominance challenged. The immediate post-war years brought dramatic changes. In 1945, voters swept Winston Churchill out of office and elected Clement Attlee's Labour government, eager for social renewal. The new government established a broad welfare state, introducing the National Health Service to provide free health care and nationalizing major industries like coal, steel, and railways. These reforms aimed to address the poverty and inequities that had persisted between the wars. Though austere, rationing remained until the early 1950s. The late 1940s saw Britons working collectively to win the peace, rebuilding homes, demobilizing millions of troops back into civilian life, and forging a modern, more egalitarian nation. On the world stage, however, Britain's supremacy ebbed. The war had cracked the pillars of the empire. Almost immediately, Britain faced pressure to grant independence to its colonies. India, the crown jewel, won independence in 1947, split into India and Pakistan, after a mass movement against colonial rule that Britain could no longer resist nor afford to oppose. One by one, in the 1950s and 1960s, Britain's Asian, African, and Caribbean colonies gained independence in a wave of decolonization. Though often peaceful, it marked the end of the British Empire as a global administrative reality. Britain sought to redefine its role, no longer an imperial ruler, but a partner in the Commonwealth of former colonies and a key ally of the United States in the new Cold War era. A poignant symbol of Britain's reduced status came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. In a misguided attempt to seize the Suez Canal after Egypt's president nationalized it, Britain launched a military intervention only to be politically humiliated when the United States and USSR opposed the action, forcing a withdrawal. Suez starkly revealed that Britain could no longer act as a great power unilaterally. Many mark it as the moment Britain's role as a world superpower effectively ended, its prestige irrevocably diminished. Thereafter, Britain aligned its foreign policy closely with the U.S. and focused on rebuilding at home and in Europe. Despite the decline of empire, Britain in the latter half of the 20th century found new strength in unity and resilience. The economy gradually recovered, shifting from heavy industry to services and technology. By the 1960s, living standards rose and British cultural influence soared anew, from the Beatles leading a musical British invasion to innovative fashion, art and film defining the swinging London era. In 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community, forerunner of the EU, signaling a turn toward Europe after the imperial chapter. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had transformed from the seat of a globe-spanning empire into a modern, multicultural nation-state. The story of England is one of constant change and renewal. From prehistoric tribes and Roman legions to Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Viking invasions, Norman rulers, and the rise and fall of dynasties, each era reshaped the nation's identity. England became the birthplace of common law, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, and the core of an empire that spanned the globe. Though its imperial power has faded, the legacy of England lives on, in its language spoken worldwide, in its institutions that inspired democracies, and in its culture that continues to influence literature, science, and politics. The history of England is not simply the past of one nation, but a narrative that helped mold the modern world.